Hello, I'm grateful for this opportunity to be here to present my work on the relationship between impulse and baseball pitching velocity in collegiate pitchers. My name is Cameron Jensen. I am a master's student at the University of Nebraska at Omaha in the sports medicine and biomechanics lab, where we have a pitching lab where this data was collected. I'd also like to thank Brandon Doney, Dr. Sam Wilkins, Dr. Adam Rosen, and Dr. Brian Nahr for their contributions to this work. I wanted to start off by talking about ground reaction forces. Ground reaction forces are very useful and informative for biomechanists, as they tell us the amount of force you exert on the ground, and then as they react up through the body through equal and opposite reactions. And thus we can provide a foundation for understanding movement dynamics. In baseball, they help us identify proper mechanics and optimal performance. We were looking at how ground reaction force relates to pitching velocity, so pitching performance. And we found that generally greater peak ground reaction forces, so having a higher max ground reaction force during the pitch, led to higher pitching velocities. However, these correlations tended to be very weak, as well as there's mixed results with different articles suggesting different things about this relationship. So peak ground reaction force, though it's commonly used, may not offer the most complete picture and may not be the best tool, which leads me to want to talk about impulse. So impulse quantifies the amount of force applied to an object over a period of time. For you mathematicians out there, it's the area under the force time curve or the integral of force with respect to time. And I like to use this example here on the right side of the screen of a graph showing the difference between peak ground reaction force and impulse. So we have our blue subject had a peak ground reaction force of roughly 1,000 newtons, or not roughly, but 1,000 newtons. And then our green subject had a peak ground reaction force of 900 newtons. However, looking at impulse, the amount of force applied over a period of time, we see that the blue subject had roughly 5,000 newton seconds of impulse, where our green subject had nearly 3 times that at 15,000 newton seconds. So we see that the green subject arguably was able to produce more force despite having a lower peak ground reaction force. This makes it incredibly useful for powerful athletic movements such as sprinting, changes of direction, chest passes, and specifically vertical and horizontal jumps. This study done by Kirby et al. Compared jump height to peak vertical force as well as to impulse. And they found that there was a very low and even negative correlation between jump height and peak vertical force of R equals negative 0.4 for static jumps and counter movement jumps. But when they looked at it compared to impulse, there's a very strong positive correlation between jump height and impulse of R equals 0.92, 0.93 for static jumps and counter movement jumps. So we see here that impulse is a very effective tool, especially compared to peak ground reaction force in this instance. However, how does that relate to baseball? There have been some studies looking at impulse related to baseball. In baseball hitting, they have found that propulsive impulse of the stride leg, so the one you step out with, and vertical impulse of the back leg are predictors of bat speed. I'm more concerned about pitching for this presentation. And in baseball pitching, the focus has primarily been on how impulse contributes to energy flow and segmental rotation. I wanted to look at how it relates to pitch velocity. There have been 2 studies that have looked at impulse compared to pitch velocity, and one was done in high school pitchers, where with a less net vertical impulse, so less total impulse upwards, there was faster pitch velocities, and then they also found that there was no significant relationships with net angular impulse. So linear impulse, I should clarify, is impulse in like a straight line, whether that's forward towards the target home plate, towards third base, or vertically. Compared to angular impulse is forces that cause you to rotate. So leaning forward or backward, tilting side to side, or rotating around your axis. And then in collegiate pitchers, they found that with greater drive leg vertical impulse, there was faster pitch velocities. And then with greater stride leg braking impulse, there were also faster pitch velocities. However, I propose that further research was needed as A, minimal research exists. B, there are potentially some conflicting results. Looking back at this slide, we see that in high school pitchers, less net vertical impulse led to faster pitch velocities, but greater drive leg vertical impulse in collegiate pitchers led to faster pitch velocities. So there's some confusion there, not sure what's going on. And then lastly, I wanted to look at individual components for both the linear and angular impulses, so like the X, Y, and Z directions from each leg. So the purpose of this study was to determine the relationship between linear and angular impulse and pitch velocity in baseball pitching, with the general hypothesis that higher impulse values will positively correlate with increased pitch velocities. Data was collected in the UNO pitching lab. We had 45 collegiate pitchers come into the lab, with 31 being right-handed, 14 being left-handed. And they underwent a biomechanical evaluation where they put on 41 retroreflective markers as pictured here, the different marker placements. And they pitched in front of 20 cameras on an instrumented pitching mound pictured there, which had 3 force plates in it. So we were able to calculate ground reaction forces as well as their kinematics and kinetics. The protocol consisted of them completing a self-selected warm-up and then pitching 5 fastballs. We took the mean of the 3 fastest pitches and used that for analysis. So here's an example of someone pitching. I'm sure you've all seen this before. And so our outcome variables were, what the variables we are concerned with was average pitch velocity, which we obtained via Stalker radar gun, and then average impulses of the drive leg, which was from pitch initiation to ball release. So when they started loading their back leg to ball release, and then of the stride leg, so from stride foot contact to ball release. Linear impulse was calculated in the X, Y, and Z direction. So again, that's towards third base, positive, towards home plate, positive Y, and then vertically was positive Z, and then the magnitude of that, or the total. And then I was also curious in the ratio of the amount of drive leg impulse to stride leg impulse, so that was also calculated. And then similarly for angular impulse for the different directions there. So this is a graph of what we found, of the outcome. So linear impulse is calculated by taking the integral of the force time curve. We see the drive leg in green and the stride leg in red, and then from pitch initiation to ball release and stride foot contact to ball release. And so impulse was calculated with the help of this curve. And then angular impulse is calculated by taking the integral of the moment versus time curve, which are pictured here. Here is our table of results for the linear impulse variables. I know there's kind of a lot of numbers up there, but the main 2 that were significant was the drive leg AP linear impulse. So drive leg impulse towards home plate, I'll refer to it as drive leg propulsive impulse. And then the drive to stride AP linear impulse ratio, so the amount of the drive leg divided by the stride leg impulse in that same direction. Also important to notice is that the stride leg AP linear impulse is not significant on its own, and I will discuss the importance of that later. And then here are the angular impulse variables and their relationship with pitch velocity. We see that there are no significant relationships between angular impulse variables and pitch velocity in this. So here's the relationship of the drive leg propulsive impulse versus pitch velocity, and we see that with higher positive linear impulse, we have higher pitch velocities. So that leads us to the conclusion that we want to increase drive leg impulse towards the target in order to increase pitch velocity. This intuitively makes sense, as with greater force for a longer period of time generated going towards home plate will help increase pitch velocity. And this further reaffirms work done by others that drive leg has a crucial role in initiating forward momentum. Now looking at the ratio of drive to stride leg propulsive AP linear impulse versus pitch velocity, we see that with higher negative ratio, we have a higher pitch velocity. And so what this ratio relationship suggests, just looking at it bare bones, is we want to maximize drive leg propulsive impulse and minimize stride leg braking impulse. However, stride leg braking impulse was not significant on its own. So we need to take that into account, as well as minimizing stride leg braking impulse, or kind of what you land on. It contradicts previous research, which recommended having greater stride leg braking impulse, as well as previous research recommended having a stabilized stride leg and stronger braking impulse, as that influences energy flow into the pitching arm. So we do not necessarily want to minimize stride leg braking impulse, and thus this further reinforces that maximizing propulsive impulse in the drive leg is beneficial towards pitch velocity. So there was also a lot of lack of significance in all the variables that we looked at. And so this indicates that linear and angular impulse are not primary determinants of pitch velocity in elite collegiate pitchers, and that other biomechanical factors may play a greater role in maximizing velocity. This goes along with what the biomechanist shared in the panel yesterday, where there's a lot of things interplaying in the pitch sequence that contribute to pitching performance. Also, we were looking at an interaction occurring at the feet with ground reaction forces, and these aren't necessarily the same forces that are being transferred effectively up to the pitching arm. So further research could look into the impulse at the pitching arm itself. So in conclusion, the drive leg's linear impulse towards the target could serve as a key performance indicator for pitch velocity. And future directions could look at investigating how a training protocol designed to increase the drive leg's propulsive impulse impacts pitching mechanics and performance. We don't want to increase this at a cost of messing with someone's mechanics and causing them to pitch worse because of it. And so that's something that could be further studied, as well as investigating how impulse values relate to injury risk. We don't want to improve someone's performance if it comes at a greater cost of injury. And then lastly, comparing impulse across skill levels, as if within the elite collegiate pitcher group that we had here, there was not major differences. But if we included high school or youth pitchers, there might be greater trends that appear for impulse. So, and then here are my references. And then thank you. Any questions yet?
Thanks. Curious why you crossed out the braking leg impulse factor when I'm just thinking, like, me not knowing anything about biomechs, but like I could see that the driving impulse minus the braking impulse is kind of intuitively like how much force you can generate in part to the baseball and then reduce that on the landing. Like, why don't you think that would kind of show up in the data?
Yeah, so I think kind of based off a lot of previous research specifically is when you land on your stride leg, that kind of helps initiate you to rotate. And rotation is a big part of baseball pitching. And so by previous research recommends having like you want your stride leg that you land on, that you brake on to be like strong and that will lead to having greater impulse values. And so if we minimize that, that could be actually detrimental to the pitching mechanics and pitching velocity, as it would impact your ability to rotate and things of that nature. And so for that reason, I recommended not minimizing stride leg braking impulse, but really focusing on and reinforcing the idea of maximizing drive leg propulsive impulse.
Makes sense. Quick follow-up, like where in the stride does the release usually occur then?
Yeah, so if we go to this graph, so during the stride, we have ball release is the solid red line and stride foot contact's the solid blue line vertical. And so you make stride foot contact, and then it's shortly after that is where you have,
Thank you so much.
Any other questions? Yeah, thank you.